Hi there. In this lecture we see Capablanca playing against David Janowski. This is in 1913, the American national tournament, round 3. E4 from Capablanca, we have E5, knight F3, knight C6, and then instead of the Raul Capablanca we have knight C3, the three knights variation. So the Raul Capablanca would have been bishop B5, but we have the three knights, and this goes into the four knights. So black sidesteps the kind of trap bishop c5. White can play knight takes e5 with advantage here. So yeah, the sensible four knights. We have bishop b5. It seems Grandmaster Gleck has shown that g3 has a lot going for it, by the way. This is a great system, especially if you want to check my King's Injured attack course. This forms an important part against e5. You can play this fianchetto here. Results are very good for white. So anyway, bishop b5 is played in this game, and we see an early kind of mistake, a6. Black could follow symmetrically to a point with bishop b4. If both sides castle, d3, d6, bishop g5, black can play in this position and should play bishop takes c3, stopping the symmetry. And okay, it swings and roundabouts. White has the bishop here, but has some structural damage. Overall, it's about even. If black, for those interested, continued the symmetry, there's a nasty shock here with bishop g4. Can you see what white plays here, which is a winning advantage? Yeah, bishop takes f6. This is a very, very big advantage. So say queen takes f6, we have knight d5 hitting the queen. And this position we can take on c6 and then take on b4. Black can try and trap the knight, sure, but knight takes c6, we take out e5 with a big advantage there. So yes, if black's forced to play something like g takes instead, that looks terrible. White can double the pawns on the other side of the board as well. And this position is glorious. If we look at this, even though black's got the bishop here, white has a fantastic position overall, especially that f5 square with a big advantage. Also, if black carried on with bishop takes f3, we can play queen takes f3, and it's not symmetrical anymore because we're taking on f6. We're damaging their structure, and knight d5 now kind of threatens things like bishop takes and knight takes, as well as knight takes c7, knight takes f6. So black's in a bad way here. Say knight d4, bishop a5, and let's say bishop a4, but let's say bishop a5 protecting c7. We can play c3 here, and this is problematic. c6 is, although it's kind of symmetrical, it's just losing. We play check and then pick up d4. So that's kind of losing. So what does black do? Yeah, black's in big trouble with check, king h1. And let's say, what does black do here? They don't need to protect the pawn. But if they play knight f4, we're doubling, we're not just doubling, we're trebling their pawns with a big advantage. Just actually we can undermine for even more advantage. If c6, knight e7 check, we're trapping the knight here with g3. So this knight's ready to be picked up shortly. This knight's trapped. So anyway, there's an adventure with symmetry, which, unlike the English opening, it doesn't carry on potentially for a lot longer. So anyway, a6 was played though, so not bishop b4. Okay, so Capablanca takes, d takes, and we have white castling. So far, in fact, black's position isn't that bad. If white had taken on e5, black has knight takes e4, knight takes, and then queen d4. This position is a small edge for white, but maybe nothing more. So, okay, white castled, bishop g4, h3, bishop h5, queen e2. And now bishop d6 is played. Maybe slightly more accurate here is knight d7. So g4, bishop g6. If white plays d4, E takes, knight takes. Yeah, black has h5, g5. Black's actually doing quite well here. Maybe even a slight edge for black. So yeah, that was an interesting alternative, knight d7. Very interesting alternative. So anyway, we have bishop d6, d3, queen e7, knight d1, black castles, knight e3, bishop g6. And now we have knight h4. So actually white is getting into a very comfortable position shortly after the opening. It seems after rook hg8, okay, this is quite nice for white. If queen e6, let's say rook d1, bishop c5, white has a4. This position, with that f5 square, overall white's slightly better. So, okay, rook hg8, knight ef5, queen e6, f4, bishop takes f5, knight takes f5, e takes f4, bishop takes f4, bishop c5 check, bishop e3, bishop f8. So black wants to maintain the bishops. Queen f2, rook d7, and now bishop c5. So Capablanca is really keen to swap these bishops off, and actually wants to lock down the c5 square. So the bishops come off, king b8. We have rook f2, knight e8, rook a f1, f6. Now in the background here, structurally, there's a minority attack where a minority of pawns can attack a majority. If white later gets in, this is in an endgame, g4, g5, white can try and fracture this structure more. So that's interesting to consider minority attack as a long-term plan. It's way off at the moment. b3, knight d6. We have rook f4, but simplification is happening now. Queen's coming off, so we are in an endgame. We're in a 2 rooks against 2 rooks endgame with double pawns here. And yeah, this is a key. I put it in the index for this course. So I want you to be able to find these endgames for later revision quite quickly. So you'll see I outlined in an article key this endgame. So the minority attack seems to be a big theme of this endgame, but as well as shutting down the opponent's pawn breaks, if we can freeze the opponent's pawns as much as possible, that is a Capablanca principle, especially if one pawn holds 2. That's a key principle. So anyway, here we see the minority attack in action, g4. We see b6, b4. Now Capablanca would absolutely love if b5 is played, because this pawn's kind of holding 2. So he's restraining the opponent's pawns. He's restrained c5 in particular. We have king b7, king f2, and now, yeah, this shows a lack of maybe interest in endgames, which Capablanca can exploit. Black plays casually b5. This self-freezes the pawns. So Capablanca must have been delighted on seeing this. Black should have played, it seems, rook a8 with an idea of a5, trying to get some counterplay before this minority attack destroys black's structure. So example, king e3, a5, a3, getting some a-file counterplay, getting ready for this minority attack with g5. But now, yeah, this should be about even though g5 happens. Black can try and make use of the rook activity as far as possible. And for example here, if rook f2 is needed, to stop rook h2, then even taking, allowing the fracture, and white has to tread carefully, rook e1. If rook takes g5, rook h2 check, and rook takes c2, it's dangerous. Otherwise, the back row's kind of dangerous here. There's rook a2 as well, if king c1. So yes, in this position, let's say rook e1, c5, b takes, rook takes g5. White's edge is only small. There is a small edge, but it's only small. But that was the way to play it. In the game, this is very self-freezing, so to speak. The black pawns are getting frozen. We have a4, and they're getting frozen even more the way Capablanca's playing this with a4. So he's first trying to freeze the pawns on the queen side, then get on the minority attack potentially. We see rook d4. If b takes a4, rook a1. Yeah, the pawns are severely fragmented. White would love this position. If we look at this position with h4, this is just very pleasant for white. And that rook a5 is going to be handy potentially. So, okay, rook d4, and we have rook b1, rook e5, king e3, rook d7, a5. So the pawns are getting frozen. Rook e6, and now the minority attack can be resumed. So this is the way, you know, modern grandmasters, like for example Michael Adams, he's fixing down, freezing the opponent's pawns often on both sides of the board. It's brilliant positional play, kind of paralyzing the opponent in the endgame. So here the minority attack, although it hasn't wrecked the structure, black's passive now on this semi-open file. We have rook g3, rook he6, h4, g6, rook g5, and this does seem to be like slot races. I used to play slot races a lot with my brother on the Atari 100. Yeah, rooks like this, two rooks against two rooks. It's like slot races on a grid. So anyway, it's amusing to me, this endgame. h6, rook g4, rook g7. Okay, so white has a very pleasant looking position. Black's pawns are really kind of frozen indeed. We see king b8, and now rook f8 check, king b7, and now e5. White is making progress, and this is not just the pass pawn, it's the hooks. The rook f6 hook is crushing. This is a crushing hook. So as well as white having a virtual extra like pass pawn, that e pawn, the f6 hook is really interesting. We have g5. If rook h7, rook f6, this position is just crushing. We're just crashing through as well. So g5, we have king e4, rook e7, h takes, rook f5. Yeah, black's on the way out in this endgame. That's a terrible pawn to lose. But yeah, there's no counterplay here now. And also with rook f8, this a6 pawn is now, you know, a terrible target. White will get past a pawn after. Check, check, c5, desperate. If king e6, rook a8, king d5, rook takes a6, rook h2, check, king c3, rook h3 check, king b2, rook h8, rook a7. This position, white's winning here because, yeah, there's a passed a pawn. That really helps. And if we get, you know, the b pawn, we've got two connected passed pawns here. So c5 is desperate in a terrible position. It's taken, rook a3. Here, if c6, rook f6 is nice, with the idea of rook d6 and e6, and this is going to be quite straightforward to win. So okay, rook a3, d5 ends the game here. Black resigned. If king e7, rook c8, king d7, rook a8, rook takes a5, c6 check. We're going to queen the pawn with d6 check. We're going to queen the c pawn, or queening something. If king e6, d takes c7, queening. If, you know, c takes d6, c7, queening. Yeah, it's interesting, yes. So the game ended at d5. It seems, yeah, Janowski had to play with active rooks. Yeah, his queenside getting frozen was not good news for this endgame. So this b5 was an incredible decision. But what is the plan? Yeah, the plan was interesting to really freeze, deep freeze the pawns with a4, a5, and then work on the king side. And then even if the structure is not dismantled, there's a semi-open g file. Let's just see that again. So deep freeze over there, g5, semi-open g file. Rather than allowing the structure to be wrecked with isolated f and h pawns, semi-open g file, white's piling up the pressure. And it's just very difficult. White's got this virtual e pawn, pass pawn, extra virtual pass pawn as well. So yeah, this builds up for the f6 hook. Black's just overloaded here. This g file pressure is actually this semi-open file in an endgame is a great asset along with that hook on f6. Black's getting a terribly weak g-pawn, and after that it's becoming more and more straightforward. Yeah, a wonderful endgame example from Capablanca. So yeah, something to study here, but there's a principle, try and not have your pawns frozen, otherwise that you're giving the opponent potentially great opportunities, as sort of free hand opportunities without too much counterplay. Okay, hope you enjoyed this one. Thanks so much. All comments, questions, likes and subscribes really appreciated. Thanks so much.